Change divergently. We live in a toxic, weird world where exposing the truth about what goes on behind the veil of the invisible hand is still considered a criminal offense. Hint: lies, violence, and systemic injustices are not a sustainable foundation for healthy societies. The discipline of weird psychology does not provide any further insights either, as it only describes the psychology of weird cults rather than a psychological foundation that applies to all forms of human society. To make sense of the world at human scale in terms of symbolic frames and metaphors, which our minds use to reason about the world and imagine new possibilities within the constraints afforded by the metaphors we live by. We cannot expect to be able to expand our repertoire of metaphors by looking at culturally well-adjusted people. The so-called window of opportunity has long closed. The carefully curated Overton window of industrialized society is a neoliberal tool for social control. It is also a symptom of terminally diseased institutions. Neuronormative people primarily learn by imitation, adopting the metaphors of the dominant culture, and only much less frequently do they invent entirely new metaphors based on patterns of first-hand non-linguistic sensory input. In contrast, autistic people learn more from conscious processing of raw sensory information, creating a space for imagining new possibilities. To expand our horizons of symbolic thought, we are well advised to look at other cultures and at autistic or otherwise socially less well-adjusted people. Once we understand the foundational role of metaphors in human thought, we can understand how propaganda works, and beyond that, how hyper-normative cultures or cults are able to generate a level of paradigmatic inertia from which it is very hard to break free, especially for well-adjusted people. Just as our sensory capabilities limit the fidelity of what we can perceive in the here and now, our culturally informed cognitive capabilities limit what we actually do perceive, can understand, make sense of, and are driven to act on in the world, all of which is mediated and constrained by the frames and metaphors we have internalized. However, internalized frames and metaphors create massive problems in large, i.e., superhuman-scale societies, misleading us to believe that we understand more about the world than we actually do. Complex industrialized societies overload us with social information from more people than we are capable of understanding, and incrementally alienate us from the non-human environment that we depend on for our basic needs and well-being.
Your discovery, can you explain what your discovery has been in terms of the understanding of and also the value of having had these mystical experiences, whether they're induced by a psychedelic drug or whether they're induced by a shamanistic practice or meditation? What is this that we're now bumping up against at this point in our human evolution?
Well, we have, in traditional psychiatry, psychology, we have the idea that these experiences are what's called altered states of consciousness, which means inauthentic, sort of distorted, due to some kind of toxic influences. These are experiences produced by the brain under certain abnormal circumstances, and they have no relevance. They're not healing, they're not transformative, they're not evolutionary.
They're just abnormalities. And
abnormalities.
Maybe you're even labeled psychotic if you have these.
Definitely. I mean, any non-ordinary state, with the exception of a dream which is not, I would have to say, which is not associated with anxiety, and it doesn't repeat too frequently, because then even dream is seen as pathological. But you can have the ordinary variety without getting a diagnosis. But any other non-ordinary state of consciousness would be seen as pathological.
So it's a diagnosis then?
So there's no distinction between a mystical or spiritual experience on the one hand and a psychotic experience. We have in modern psychiatric literature actually a lot of books and articles discussing what would be the best diagnosis. You know, Ramakrishna was a schizophrenic. Saint John of the Cross was hereditary degenerative.
Was
Saint
Buddhist
Teresa,
delusional or Buddha delusional?
Sure, I mean, he had, hallucinations from it. So he would be schizophrenic, or if he, happened to function, he would be called borderline. There is even a paper by Franz Alexander, who's one of the founders of psychosomatic medicine, where meditation is pathologized. It's a paper called Buddhist Training as Artificial Catatonia. So an unbelievable approach, that pathologizes the whole, not only ritual and spiritual history of humanity, where great religions were started by schizophrenics, but also the cultural history, because, religion played an enormous role in human history. And the idea how experiences of schizophrenics, caused by some kind of unknown brain pathology, could have ultimately led to building of cathedrals, Gothic cathedrals, or Muslim mosques or Hindu temples, and that they would inspire great composers, great artists.
Yes.
A lot of people are relatively normal.
Neurology is often a trap that reifies a misleading narrative that our brains determine who we are. And this is reified by the compound word neurodiversity. We prefer the term neurosomatic diversity. Our brains have evolved to support our lives, which can only be fulfilling in feeling. That said, the holotropic mind tends to expect one thing to follow from another, like a fractal. This rests on a somatic understanding that consciousness is cellular. When we experience cognitive sensory dissonance, it can feel like the whole infinite pattern that we are a part of gets erased. Our attention follows our interest path, so in any given situation, that is as likely to be something idiosyncratic as it is to be what everyone else is looking at or listening to, etc. Polytropic people have more compartmentalized experiences and take part in activities that add up to a sense of wholeness. It is very helpful to remember this when we are faced with a double empathy problem. Anecdotally, polytropic people seem to get a good taste of the holotropic experience of openness with extensive meditation practice or a below hallucination dose of LSD, psilocybin, etc., and then seem to be able to better appreciate our radically different way of being.
So after your experience, this must have caused you some trouble to realize that is the commonly held notion about all experiences. They're all
yes, there was no,
being a net case, so to speak.
Yeah, working with these experiences, for a number of years, it became absolutely obvious to me that these are, if anything, those are supernormal experiences that are not altered states. They are not distortions of what the world is like or what we are like, but that they kind of show us certain additional dimensions of us as human beings and additional dimensions of reality which are not available in the ordinary state of consciousness. So they're complementary. You know, mystics, when they have a mystical experience, they don't have the sense that they experience some kind of distortion of how things are. On the contrary, they experience a sense that now they really have some profound understanding of what existence is about. They get a peace which they were missing up to that point. So the everyday and the non-ordinary of what I call holotropic, which is a certain important subcategory of non-ordinary experiences, that those are complementary. Each of them gives you perspective on a different sector or as
Neurology is often a trap that reifies a misleading narrative that our brains determine who we are, and this is reified by the compound word neurodiversity. We prefer the term neurosomatic diversity. Our brains have evolved to support our lives, which can only be fulfilling in feeling. That said, the holotropic mind tends to expect one thing to follow from another, like a fractal. This rests on a somatic understanding that consciousness is cellular. When we experience cognitive sensory dissonance, it can feel like the whole infinite pattern that we are a part of gets erased. Our attention follows our interest path, so in any given situation, that is as likely to be something idiosyncratic as it is to be what everyone else is looking at or listening to, etc. Polytropic people have more compartmentalized experiences and take part in activities that add up to a sense of wholeness. It is very helpful to remember this when we are faced with a double empathy problem. Anecdotally, polytropic people seem to get a good taste of the holotropic experience of openness with extensive meditation practice or a below hallucination dose of LSD, psilocybin, etc. And then
which involves relaxation of the body, bringing yourself into the present moment. And then at a certain point you start breathing a little faster, deeper than usual, tying the inhalation and the exhalation into a kind of circle of breath. And then we start playing powerful music, usually music that's drawn from some of the ethnic traditions, from cultures that you are using music to change consciousness.
Kind of training the brain?
Yeah, let's say the different African cultures or some other non-Western cultures developed drumming rhythms that can very powerfully change the brain functioning, induce a trance state. Or we play, Tibetan ritual music or Sufi music. Also some good contemporary music, particularly one that's inspired by these spiritual or ethnic traditions.
Before you continue this, just to interject something, the breath has always been considered a pathway to enlightenment in many ancient cultures, hasn't it?
In many ancient cultures, you see, breath somehow touches on many different levels. I mean, it's the physical level, it's the air that you breathe, then and a very important physiological function. You couldn't live without breathing. But it's also connecting then with the psyche, and through the psyche to the spirit. In many cultures, linguistically, there is a deep connection between breath and spirit. Like if you have terms like pneuma in the Gnostic tradition, it means breath, but also the cosmic essence, or prana in the Indian culture, or ki in the Japanese culture, chi in the Chinese culture, ruach in the Hebrew tradition.
And here we are, a culture that barely even breathes
True,
in the
yeah.
United States.
True.
For all of human history, moving, singing, clapping, dancing, playing were seamlessly integrated into the community, and everybody was expected to be a participant. Over time, people would get into an entrained peak state together, a non-ordinary state, which they then found was healing and essentially sort of reset the Etch-a-Sketch. Ron Siegel at UCLA has gone as far as saying that it's not even a human drive for intoxication. It's not even a mammalian drive. It's even true for birds and all sorts of different species. The desire to seek altered or non-ordinary states of awareness or consciousness is so pervasive that he even goes as far as calling it a fourth basic survival drive. Our desire to shift states meaningfully is pretty hardwired, never mind what our particular cultures, customs, or taboos might be. We can make use of widely available substances, and we can combine them with other skillful protocols that we understand how our bodies and brains work to reliably deliver us to peak experience.
World, but from my study of it, from what I can understand, and from my my limited personal experiences, it's rapidity. Yeah, it's that one can have an experience, a profoundly transpersonal experience, or a profound experience of relaxing defenses and integrating material that's been pushed off. With, if we look at the FDA-controlled trials of using them as a model, they're usually involving something like 6 hours of psychotherapeutic preparation, and then a day-long experience in which people are reporting these profoundly transformative experiences. With meditative practices, it takes a while longer. There's a reason why most intensive retreat practice in the meditative world is you go off to some place surrounded usually by nature that feels very safe, where the cell phone is gone, and the intrusions of the nightly news aren't there, and the setting is also very, very important for that. And as people know who have sat silent retreats, if you immediately come out of a silent retreat and walk into a shopping mall, it is quite overwhelming, and it's difficult. It's difficult to integrate that level of stimulation because one becomes quite sensitized, and that happens as well with these with psychedelics, that one becomes quite sensitized, and that's part of the softening of the repression barrier and the removal of this our usual defense, or the relaxing of our usual defenses, which is a good thing in terms of integrating material that we're ready to integrate and haven't yet been able to integrate. But it could be not such a good thing if we're in an environment that doesn't feel safe. Those defenses, every one of our defenses that we construct for good reason. At some point in our life, something felt too painful to be able to fully embrace it. So, when doing this work, whether meditatively or in these supervised psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy sessions, it needs to be done carefully with a deep respect for why those defenses evolved in the first place, how they have served us well, and this isn't about just blasting away the bad defenses so as to have these wonderful experiences. It's about learning how to relax the defenses, seeing how they have served us well, and seeing how they have not served us so well.
Yeah.
The dissolution of defenses in a psychedelic experience, or you could taste that in meditative practice. But to really live our lives less defended, that's a gradual process. It's a maturation process. In Tibet, prior to the origins of or the introduction of Buddhism in Tibet, they had a mythology. It was a mythical kingdom called Shambhala. Many of us know that because there's Shambhala Press and the Shambhala community of Tibetan Buddhists. And in the Shambhala kingdom, the highest accomplishment was to be a Shambhala warrior. And these were not warriors with spears and knives and shields and the like. These were warriors of the heart. And they were said to have the courage to feel everything. That was their warrior courage. And the metaphor they used for it was horrifying. They said it was to be in the world like a cow without its skin, every nerve ending exposed, feeling it all. It was actually a model for what would it be like to not have psychological defenses. What would it be like if we actually felt everything, every joy, every sorrow, every injury we've ever encountered, every moment of love and connection we've ever had, every self-esteem boost where we think, oh, look how wonderful I am, every self-esteem collapse where we think, oh, what a horrible failure I've been, to be open to the full range of experience. And it's interesting, in Western psychology, we don't have any such ideal. We have the idea that, well, it would be better to have mature defenses like sublimation or humor or even rationalization than it would be to have immature defenses like projection, like schizoid.
The warrior is sensitive to every aspect of phenomena: sight, smell, sound, feelings. He appreciates everything that goes on in his world as an artist does. His experience is full and extremely vivid. The rustling of leaves, the sound of raindrops on his coat are very loud. Occasional butterflies fluttering around him may be almost unbearable because he is so sensitive. Because of his sensitivity, the warrior can then go further in developing his discipline. He begins to learn the meaning of renunciation. In the ordinary sense, renunciation is often connected with asceticism. You give up the sense pleasures of the world and embrace an austere spiritual life in order to understand the higher meaning of existence. In the Shambhala context, renunciation is quite different. What the warrior renounces is anything in his experience that is a barrier between himself and others. In other words, renunciation is making yourself more available, more gentle and open to others. Any hesitation about opening yourself to others is removed for the sake of others. In other words, in meditation, you can experience a sense of existence or being that includes your thoughts, is not conditioned by your thoughts or limited to your thinking process. You experience your thoughts, you label them thinking, and you come back to your breath, going out, expanding, and dissolving into space. It is very simple, but it is quite profound. You experience your world directly, and you do not have to limit that experience. You can be completely open, with nothing to defend and nothing to fear. In that way, you are developing renunciation, or personal territory, and small-mindedness. At the same time, renunciation does involve discrimination. Within the basic context of openness, there is a discipline of what to ward off or reject, or what to cultivate or accept. The positive aspect of renunciation, what is cultivated, is caring for others. But in order to care for others, it is necessary to reject caring only for yourself, or the attitude of selfishness. A selfish person is like a turtle carrying its home on its back wherever it goes. At some point, you have to leave home and embrace the larger world. That is the absolute prerequisite for being able to care for others. In order to overcome this selfishness, it is necessary to be daring. It is as though you were dressed in your swimsuit, standing on the diving board with a pool in front of you, and you ask yourself, now what? The obvious answer is jump. That is daring. You might wonder if you will sink or hurt yourself if you jump. You might. There is no insurance, but it is worthwhile jumping to find out what will happen. The student warrior has to jump.
Easing into that and not panicking that, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose all my gains because my old defenses are coming back. That's even true after sitting for a half an hour, 45 minutes in the morning. And if we're having one of those days in which we're blessed by relaxing deeply and being present and being sensitized and really opening to experience in mindfulness practice. And sometimes that happens, in a morning sitting or an evening sitting outside of a retreat context. And then, realizing, well, then we check our email and it's like, we start to notice, oh, I experience every email as a threat. That's interesting. That's a very interesting observation. Look at that. There's a little bit of constriction. My heart races a little bit. It's like, oh no, how is this email going to hurt my feelings? And, when we're more sensitized, we start noticing that's actually true of every email that we encounter throughout our lives, right? But we don't notice it unless we're sensitized, and we have to somehow be gentle and compassionate with ourselves as we notice, oh, I've just discovered I'm afraid of all of my emails.
I love this idea of kindness and appreciation for your defenses, that they've been doing something to serve you and you can't just jettison them, without some thinking and feeling your way through that.
My friend and colleague, Dick Schwartz, who developed something called internal family systems, which is really simply the observation that, gosh, we're made up of a lot of different parts, right? And in this context, there's a part of us that would like to be able to reintegrate and feel all these things and be whole again. But there's a part of us that is appropriately scared to death of that. The part of us that originally blocked out these experiences because they were too much at the time. And, one of the ethos in internal family systems, which absolutely carries through with mindfulness-informed psychotherapy, is everything's welcome. And all of those parts are important. So the defenses, they're there for a reason. They're our friends. This is important, as is the impulse to relax them, as are all the parts that we've blocked out of awareness,
This is not how most autistic people's brains work, I imagine, but it's how mine works. I imagine that being inside my mind, depending on the instance and circumstances, it is like an acid trip. I've never used psychedelic drugs, but it's always struck me as strange to hear people gush about their experiences on an acid trip, LSD. I didn't realize that most people's brains don't work the way mine does, but they were describing every other day in my head. I'm not sure where the synesthesia ends and the sensory processing begins, but I've got a heavy helping of both, and some other things on top of that. Holotropic people have naturally wide open sensory gates to participate in as the immense world without becoming overwhelmed. We holotropes have two central methods. One by hyperfocusing our attention on one sensory or cognitive path, and as through synesthesizing our experience into coherence. A sense of wholeness occurs through both of these processes. Less consciously in hyperfocus, more consciously in coherence. Hyperfocus may occur within singular monotropic or connective syntropic attention paths, tunnels and rhizomes. Both types of paths create flow states, wherein one is deeply engaged. Hyperfocus is a kind of flooding of certain pathways, which therein quiets dissonance from conflicting inputs. To be monotropic is to be focused with fidelity. To be syntropic is to be immersed and perhaps inventive. While autistic people are not the only ones capable of absorption, it is the signature of a holotropic life. If hyperfocus is flow, coherence is profound rest. It is effortless integration. While it has been given little consideration in autism studies, embodied coherence is arguably our true gift, that we can both receive and give. when we are able to abide in receptive open awareness, we find we are wholeness itself.
Where we are, sort of our mission in life, our destiny. Can you talk about that?
Well, what I have observed repeatedly in some of my patients and other kind of people who were doing work with me, either with psychedelics or the holotropic breathwork, or even people going through spontaneous episodes of holotropic states, was that after they did some significant inner work through out of the traumatic past, that they got a sense that they discovered something like an authentic script that they brought into this incarnation. And that got distorted, sometimes in the womb, when there were already traumatic things happening, certainly in the hours in the birth canal, and then in the family dynamics, again, traumatic imprints of various kinds, but also the inauthentic scripts that their parents or the culture laid on them. They had certain plans, what they should do, how they should be like, which was not really the original script that they brought into this incarnation. And when they were able to clear that, then somehow this authentic script emerged, and they were doing something that Joseph Campbell described as following their bliss. Suddenly they felt that things, fell into place, and suddenly they were achieving things with much less effort. They actually observed sometimes amazing synchronicities. The right kind of people appeared, or the right kind of information, or even the money came. And they basically were operating in a way that was fulfilling for them, but also serving some kind of a larger cause. Actually,